Hello, and welcome to the Freeman Daily Show. I'm your host, Miss Freeman, and this is my special guest, Mrs. Brownstead. Mrs. Brownstead, what do you teach at Boone County High School?
I teach social studies. I teach AP Human Geography, Modern Wars, and U.S. History. So I'm so happy to be on the show. I love your work, Miss Freeman.
She's a big fan. So I'm teaching a lesson with Miss Brownstead today because we kind of wanted to pair up and talk about environmental science and specifically some of the current events that are going on with our environment and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And since that's current events and it's in the news, that is like history class. So today our topic is Greta Thunberg. And Miss Brownstead, can you just give us like a quick little overview? Who is Greta Thunberg for people who've never heard of her?
Yeah, I would love to. Greta Thunberg is from Sweden. She's 17 years old, so this is why this is even more cool, because she is our students' ages, and she is an environmental activist as a high schooler. What started as a strike from school, she would go sit out front of the Swedish parliament, their government system, and she would hold a sign that said, "School strike for climate." And that gained so much attention. It started to be every Friday, all the schools would have to close because so many students were protesting to make sure that the government took necessary precautions for the climate. And so not only is Greta this voice of a generation, she's a voice for the planet. And I think she just does a great job of showing that you're never too small or too young to make a difference. She has spoken at 2 United Nations climate change conferences in Europe and the United States, and she's even given a TED Talk. And in the TED Talk, which is this famous group where you can go in and deliver a speech, she revealed that she had Asperger's, OCD, and selective mutism. And she said, while my selective mutism, meaning sometimes she can't talk, she says, I talk when it's important. And she's become this spokesperson for the planet and for the climate. And she said that Asperger's, she doesn't view it as something that holds her back, but rather that it's her superpower. So I think she's just super inspirational. I really like Greta. I'm glad to be here to talk about her with you, Ms. Freeman.
Yeah, I love that. So just to back up a little bit, you said that she had talked at 2 United Nations conferences. That sounds really important. For those of us who are not history buffs, what is a United Nations conference and why is it important?
The United Nations is an organization where multiple countries, many countries across the whole world, join together to meet up and talk about issues that affect the world as a whole. And the UN started after we saw many world wars, and we decided we wanted to move towards more of a peaceful globe rather than one that constantly went to war. So it handles things like threats and nuclear weapons, right? So we see that in the news a lot with the UN, but they also meet to talk about the climate because that's something that impacts everyone no matter where you live on the globe.
Awesome. So I'm going to give us some of the science information background so that her speech makes a little bit more sense. So some of this will be a recap for my students. Some of it will kind of be like a little preview because we talk about environmental science a little bit in every science class and it kind of builds on each other. So I'm going to switch my screen and show you guys some graphs really quick. So this first graph is how much carbon dioxide emissions are happening around the globe. So carbon dioxide emissions, remember CO2, that is directly linked to climate change. And that term emissions, that's just like how much CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. And this graph is specifically CO2 emissions that come from burning fossil fuels. So you can see that it was almost nothing, pretty low in the 1800s, and then late 1800s it started increasing, and then 1900s it kept increasing, and then we see it at 2000 it is all the way up here, into like almost 9,000 million tons of carbon. That's a lot. And we are in 2020 now, so if this graph continued, we would be practicing our extrapolation of data, and I would guess that this would continue to increase and it would be more like 11 or 12,000 now. So based on that, you can see that our carbon dioxide is going up and up and up. So Ms. Brownstead, I'm back on your screen. Why do you think the carbon dioxide emissions would be going up starting around like 1850 or so and just increasing and increasing?
Right. Well, in our history classes, we learned that in the mid 1800s, we see a rise in the Industrial Revolution. We're starting to make steamboats and railroad locomotives, and that is emitting smoke and gases and carbon into the atmosphere, and that erodes the atmosphere and makes it harder for us to breathe, and kind of makes life a little tough. And that only got worse in the early 1900s with the beginning of cars. And so, I mean, you see in the 1950s, the United States became a car culture. Almost every family now had a car. It wasn't just a luxury anymore. Now we see in most families, every driving age adult has a car. And so imagine how much that multiplies the carbon emissions in the atmosphere.
Yeah, so carbon emissions come from burning fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, natural gas. Burning all of those will add carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. So I'm going to switch my screen over and show you some other information. So this graph is the history of the carbon dioxide levels. So this is just another graph that shows like a little bit more in detail as the years go on. So you can see that carbon dioxide emissions have kind of gone up and down, like it wasn't just a steady increase, but there's this dotted line. And the main point of this graph is written right here, all right? So for so many years, atmospheric carbon dioxide has never been above this line. So I said, it kind of fluctuated, but it never got above that dotted line. And then now you can see the current level is far beyond that line. So that's why Greta Thunberg is seeing this data and being like, hey, this is a huge problem. Why are you not doing anything to stop it? And like you say, you're going to decrease it some. That's not good enough. Like we have got so far to move to fix this problem. And I want to show you two specific effects of this CO2. So Greta Thunberg, some of her evidence, a lot of her evidence, all is about CO2 emissions and our carbon footprint. So remember, like she is fighting to decrease climate change. So the climate change that we're talking about here and specifically in our science classes stems from increased CO2 in the atmosphere. And in the ocean, like in biology, you guys do a unit on ocean acidification and sea otters and sea urchins. Well, here's just some of the effects of that increased CO2. It can make the water warmer, there will be less oxygen in the water, and it will become more acidic. So you can see here that affects the sea level. Coral bleaching is when it just completely wipes out all of the coral in an area. And that's a big problem because that is like, it's like forests for underwater. A lot of animals live there and need that coral to survive. The algae can become toxic. It completely changes the habitats, which affects the animals. They might move, they might die. They would have to change their diet. It leads to ocean acidification, which in biology you guys learn about how that affects certain species. And overall, like it can completely change environments. This picture also shows some potential effects beyond just aquatic ecosystems. So it can affect the forests in our world, it can affect our water supply, our water resources, it can affect the health of people. It can also affect our agriculture, so the crops that people are growing. So that is just a really quick recap of what climate change is, why it's important, and why the heck Greta Thunberg cares about it so much. So let's discuss Greta's speech. So we've been looking at Greta Thunberg's speech, the "How dare you" speech. So give me like a quick little recap of what she's saying in this speech and some of the things that stood out to you.
What really stands out to me, because I also coach the speech and drama team, the forensics team. So to hear a young person so passionately speaking, and she's well researched and she's well spoken, and you can just hear in the tone of her voice, it's not just something she wrote down and is reading off a paper. She truly believes it and is truly asking for lawmakers to help stop this and to help make a change when it comes to our climate. So it just really stands out to me to hear a 17-year-old say to a room full of adults who make the laws, where she says, "You have stolen my childhood," right? She's not outside carefree, making TikTok videos and doing Fortnite dances and playing, right? She is worried about the fact that we're destroying the planet. How much longer will we even be able to live? And as a kid, what does her adulthood look like? Will she be able to maybe have children? Will there even be a planet then? And she's saying to them, how dare you say you're going to make changes and you're not? And look at me, look at my face. I am the face of the children of the world, and you're doing nothing for us. Yeah. And so that's what stood out to me. I would love to hear your take on some of the statistics and the terms she used for the science side of it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you there. Like, just the way that she went about that argument. I mean, I also teach English classes. Like, let's talk about pothos. Let's talk about logos, because, like, she killed it. But, I mean, for years, people have been talking about climate change, reduce, reuse, recycle, all of this stuff. And we've been changing for years. But I really feel like Greta was the first person who stood up to these lawmakers and was just like, look, the stuff you're doing, that doesn't cut it. Like, that's not good enough for me, and I'm the one that matters, because you're gonna die and I'm gonna be around to clean up the mess you made.
Okay, boomer.
Okay, boomer.
Miss Freeman, that's why I love this generation too. Gen Z, our students, they're just so resilient and they're so aware of what's going on, and they don't complain if changes need to be made, and they don't fight back against progress. They're the ones behind it, and I don't get when people are mad at Gen Z. Okay, they ate a couple Tide Pods, but this generation, our students, they're just they have the power, right? I'm really impressed with them. I'm always impressed with our students.
Yeah, same. And I love that she did like bring emotion into it. I mean, it grips me, man, yeah, when I watch it. But I love that she brought emotion into it, and she did use that pothos argument, that emotional argument, to discuss children. And I mean, you've got to assume that all of these leaders have families, and whether or not they have kids, they probably have family members that do have kids, and like they have lived their life, and now they're kind of just like riding out their golden years. But what Greta is saying is, no, like, you're not leaving anything behind for me
Right.
and you're not leaving anything behind for your kids except disaster. And is that what you want for us? Like, I just think, when it comes to political things like this, so many people just go straight to the logos argument, which would be like her evidence being statistics and graphs and whatnot. And that is so important. But I just think the way she went about this argument, it really made people listen. So
I agree.
props to Greta.
And to add to what you're saying, even if these lawmakers don't have children, they're representing people from their contingency, their state, their region, right? And they should be the voice of children like Greta.
Yeah.
They are. And the fact that it's taking a 17-year-old to call them out on it,
Mm-hmm.
I continue to be impressed by her. She was up for a Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And I love when that happens for young people. I've only seen it before with Malala, another fantastic young lady.
Ooh.
I could go on a tangent there.
We'll have to have another Freeman Daily show just about her. But as far as the science goes, so one of the pieces of evidence that she uses is that, some studies show that carbon dioxide emissions have decreased. And she's saying like, oh, you're going to decrease carbon dioxide emissions by this much, or it's already decreased by this much. She is still saying, like, she's using that as a counterclaim argument and just being like, that's not good enough.
Right.
And I think, as far as like making your claim, your evidence, your reasoning, that is a solid piece of evidence because she's pointing out very real changes that have been made, but she's bringing it to reality. And she's saying like those statistics, it doesn't include this and this and this. And like realistically decreasing by 50%, that's not enough. And it's not going to last. Like we need to make real changes that will like sustain, meaning like they'll last for years and years. So I think
counterclaims are really important in history too. When you're writing argumentative papers, your paper looks stronger when you say, you may argue this, you're doing this, and then you debunk it.
Yeah.
You can prove it wrong. And so I agree, whether it's science, English, or history, they're all connected. All of this, we're living in history.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. How does this topic and what Greta Thunberg is saying, like, how does that relate to our world in, 2020? Like, what's going on right now? How is climate change being affected? Take it away, Ms. Brownstead.
Sure. Well, 75% of the planet has been altered by humans. And so what that means is we've changed the landscape. If there's a mountain, we blow it up and put a road. If there's, water, we make an island in it. So when we do this, we're putting a lot of stress on our planet. And that stresses all the ecosystems and the animals and wildlife. And so speaking of 2020, we've seen the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic that's been steadily happening since January. And I think, I know Greta Thunberg has a quote on this where she said, if a virus can wipe out the world's economy in a week, what could it do? Like, what could climate change do to humanity? Mm-hmm. And so we've been seeing that since the COVID-19 pandemic, greenhouse gases are down and the air quality is up. We're seeing improvements. It's almost like the world is able to take a breath because people aren't putting that much stress on the planet anymore. But here's the problem. This is only temporary, right? Unless when this pandemic comes to a close and we start going back to normal life, whatever that may look like, we will have to continue the progress that was already made to help the planet. It's just like a Band-Aid for now. Also, in a pandemic, especially one for a disease, we may all be at home, so waterways are getting clearer and the air is becoming less polluted, but we're using more medical and hazardous waste. And where do we like to dump that? Into our water systems and our oceans, right? So there are so many sides to this. So I really hope that this can be a lesson we can, for some cities who have never seen the blue skies before because it's been smoggy and bleak and dark, and now people have been inside for just 1 or 2 months, and you can see the sun again and you can see the stars at night. I would hope that that would turn people more towards Greta's message about being an advocate, someone who speaks up for the planet and doing good by the planet.
Yeah. I really loved that quote that you pointed out, that Greta Thunberg, like if a virus can do like totally, wipe out economy in a week, like what could climate change do to humanity? And it does remind me, we sometimes have a unit on coral bleaching when we teach this topic, but for those of you who are not in that class right now or did not do that unit this year, coral bleaching is, again, just like all of the coral in an area will die, and they call it bleaching because one of the first signs of that is it loses all of its color and it turns white. And it looks really cool until you learn about it, and then it's really sad because you realize that that entire area is dying and it's killing all of the wildlife around it that thrive from the coral. So I was shocked when I first learned that coral bleaching, the effect of coral bleaching, it happens because of increased CO2 and whatnot, but it can happen when the temperature of that water, of that ecosystem, is raised 1 or 2 degrees. Like 1 or 2 degrees, that's not much. So just seeing those, like the littlest things that seem so little to me, I mean, that completely destroys environments and entire coral reefs. So, she hit the nail on the head with that one.
I did see, on a positive note with that a lot of people in Australia who work in the environmental industry are planting new coral. I don't know what the word would be for that, since it's a living being organism.
Yeah.
They're reintroducing living coral into reefs and areas, since there isn't a lot of like boat traffic and people swimming in the waters.
That's interesting. I would love to do some follow-up research on that. So having said that, we see that during this pandemic, our carbon emissions are decreasing. Earlier, we said like some of the things that produce carbon emissions are like driving cars, factories. So we know a lot of factories are shut down right now. And as far as cars go, most people are staying home a lot more. So for example, usually people buy gas, like once or twice a week. I have not bought a tank of gas in my car since March 10th, and now it is May. So, that's a huge difference of how much.
As a Prius owner, if everyone comes to the Prius life, you never have to fill up your tank.
True. If only we were all as cool as you, Miss Brownstead.
Prius and cool, they go together.
Exactly. So, having said that, that's our current situation. When the economy does start opening back up and we're allowed to go places, how do you think that we could sustain this type of change so that the ozone layer doesn't deplete again, so that our carbon emissions can stay a little bit down? Well, what are some of the practical things that we can do?
Always combining trips, right? If you've got to do 4 errands, save it all for one day and just do it all then, rather than driving 4 separate times, 4 days in a row. Carpool, right? Take the bus. Use metal straws.
Yes.
Turn off lights when you're not using them. Don't, run water unnecessarily. Just start to be very aware of your surroundings. I mean, Greta doesn't even fly on planes because of the carbon emission. When she came from Sweden to the United States, she took a sailboat.
Yeah.
And so, granted, you know, we're not all flying across the world all the time, right? But just being aware of industries we're supporting and what that carbon footprint, how we're adding to the carbon footprint.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say that energy usage is a huge thing. I mean, I even think about our school right now. Like, I wonder what the energy bill is like. I'm sure it's a lot cheaper because we're not using all of that energy. Now, obviously, when we go back, we'll have to have lights on and everything. But, you know, at home, I think of all of the stuff that is plugged in or left turned on. Or, you know, am I using more water than I need? Am I leaving lights on? Like, those all use energy. And in our integrated science electricity unit, we learned kind of where that comes from and how, like, generators and power plants work. And then we kind of follow up with that in chemistry. The chemistry class is learning about alternative power plants and how can we get electricity or energy without using like burning fossil fuels. So anyways, I think we are just about out of time. So that is it today for the Freeman Daily Show. But Miss Brownstead, thank you so much for being my special guest. And we will see you guys next time. Bye.
Thank you for having me.